So, Matt, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Vive.
Yeah, it's good to see you. It's good to see you. So, I think for the benefit of the audience, what I would love to do is for you to just kind of give us a quick refresher on who the hell is Matt Fates, and like where does Matt Fates come from and what happened to Matt Fates after 92? Because I like to start these conversations there, even though I might know some of this already, because obviously, we spent a lot of time together at Exeter. And so it's kind of like a real treat for me to just see you in this context to catch up on all of that plus more. And we're going to spend some time talking about VC technology investing in the Boston VC technology world that you're from. And I'm from the California sort of side of that equation in Silicon Valley as a product marketer in B2B SaaS, not so much on tech side. I'm sorry, not so much on the investing side, but on the operator side. And so I've been eager to get you on to talk to you about this whole domain. But before we jump into that, tell us about Matt.
Let's see. I'll try to do the bicycle ride through the museum, I guess, at this point. College, ended up double majoring in computer science and economics. I'd always been a computer nerd and played with computers, even all through Exeter, even though there weren't any classes in that back then, but got sort of reconnected with it in college. Mm-hmm. And I think my choice coming out was, do I pursue the business side of technology or actually go write software, which I had done for one of my summers and really enjoyed. Actually, it was for the Navy and I got to live in Hawaii. It was a great summer. I was also worried at that point, graduating very serious with a particular woman who I've now been married to for almost 25 years. And so I ended up going and working in sort of the business side, effectively Wall Street, and worked in an investment bank for a few years, learning the financial side of technology and how companies go public and get acquired and raise, private capital and so on, which was great in that you learn a lot. It was miserable in that you work like 100 hours a week and you often have projects dropped on you at 7 p.m. as the managing director is going home to go to his family, and you're now going to work on that until 5 a.m. So I didn't really love the investment banking part, but I did love working with some of those sort of neat companies that back in those days were sort of forming the internet, right? And just starting to take advantage of what was going on as we came out of college in the mid 90s. And so for me, the path to venture capital it was based on a seed that had been planted again in college. I was fortunate enough to take a class from a team that ran the endowment at Yale. And David Swenson was really a thought leader in asset management. And he was one of the first people to drive a lot of a large university's endowment into, things like venture capital, private equity, real estate, right? The alternative asset classes out of just stocks and bonds. And in doing so, he wrote a whole book called Portfolio Theory and how you could increase your return by taking more risk. But in the end, you're actually not taking more risk based on this sort of curve that he proved. And the way he taught the class was to bring in managers from the different types of asset classes. And so when the partner, who was, I think, visiting his daughter on campus, came and spoke at the class from venture capital, it sort of just clicked with me as like, that sounds really interesting. A combination of technology, business, getting to work across lots of different companies, getting to see technology across different use cases. It sort of appealed to me. So while I didn't have any idea how I would possibly pursue it or get into it, because it wasn't something that was sort of in the zeitgeist of the time, none of my friends in college knew what it was or what it meant. It just sort of registered in the back of my head as like, that sounds like an interesting thing to point towards. So coming out of technology investment banking for a few years, it actually was a good time. The venture was growing. The internet was sort of being built. Everyone was excited about .coms, 97, 98, 99. And so I basically found a great firm that was looking for a young person to help them come and figure out the internet. And I got lucky in that the partner I worked with most directly was just a wonderful mentor, wonderful person, very grounded in being a human and being a father and a husband and, all of the important things, but also a very good investor. And it sort of taught me how to focus on the important things within the businesses and to not get too wrapped up around, sort of little stuff. It was a great couple of years as the, internet bubble inflated, he definitely sort of saw the end coming, at least of that phase of growth, and encouraged me to go maybe take some time, go to business school, do something. So I did. I went to business school up at Dartmouth. Really enjoyed a couple of years living in the Upper Valley, but then got back into venture after that and have been in it since.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a pretty short path actually, right into the growth curve of the first .com boom. If you were there in 96, 97, late 90s. Myself, I jumped in 99, right when you had about a year before it crashed.
Yep.
And so I was more on the operator side in the IT consulting world. And it's kind of remarkable, right, Matt, isn't it? I mean, the way technology moves so quickly, when I think of where we were in 1999 with the internet compared to where we are now, um, is literally galaxies, light years away, wouldn't you say?
Well, I mean, exactly. You remember, I mean, it's sort of fun to think about when we were really young, right? Just getting into school, or we were still using these big floppy disks or like cassette tapes, and that was memory, right? And now you have, 1,000x that in your smartphone, right? And I actually have some old funny ones here, like this, one of the early phones, right?
Oh my God.
And then this was a cool one, a little BlackBerry where you actually had the keyboard slide down. But anyways, things move so fast in the technology world. I actually, funnily enough, I met I first interacted with Katie, who's now my wife, in this sort of Unix-based texting system that was only on computers, only on our university campus. It was called Y-Talk, right? And you would Y-Talk someone's campus address, and then a window would pop up and it would split in half. Again, this is all just like Unix and text-based. And you could communicate, and whatever I typed, she could see, and whatever she typed, I could see. There was no, now when you text with a phone, like you can see the dot, 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 someone's typing something, but you can't actually see what they're writing. Back then, you could see it all, right? So
Really?
there was no really sort of thinking about it. It was just out there. But anyways, that's how rudimentary things were. And you just, it does show how old we are, really, is what it does.
It does. It does. Yeah, I know. It does. And it's also remarkable. The user interfaces that you're talking about have changed so much, but they're also the same. They're like what's changed so much in some ways is also the same, right? And it's sort of a weird paradox of technology, because to hear you describe that Y-Talk system, I can tell you like where we are with WhatsApp today is kind of reminiscent of where we were at one time with AOL. Right? AOL had this chat thing. What did they call it?
AOL Messenger.
Yeah. Yeah. AOL Messenger was like a kind of progenitor of a lot of today's tech messaging apps. So in some ways, there's really nothing new about WhatsApp fundamentally in terms of the experience of messaging to one another. It's just, I think, at a much bigger scale.
Well, yeah, I mean, now the internet and, it's sort of ubiquitous, right? It's reached certainly completely all the developed world, even much of the developing world. And many parts of the developing world have leapfrogged in some ways, right? In payments and in, the way they use mobile phones and so on, because they didn't have that interim step. They just went from nothing all the way to smartphones.
Where have you seen that?
Well, I mean, I was never one for the consumer apps and the consumer products and so on. Not because I don't think they're interesting. It's just not where my professional expertise kind of, was. I am, in that realm, I'm, pretty much just like everyone else. I'm not more sophisticated or less sophisticated about consumer apps these days. And, this is a tunnel we could go down or not, but social media, I think, is unfortunately far more negative than positive overall. I really wish we could control it in ways that we don't today. Sam Brown and I have actually had some pretty long conversations about this stuff over the years. My kids are older, and so I've kind of been through the effects of that, really. And to some degree, it was kind of landing in a serious way right as they were getting to the age where they were starting to use technology. Sam's kids are now getting to that age, and hopefully we've learned some things between then and now.
Yeah, let's spend a minute on this, Matt. I wanna tie that back because a lot of the folks that are listening to this know you or know of you from Exeter. And you mentioned your kids and Katie, your wife, who I remember meeting at one of the reunions. Um, so, so just a couple quick kind of back notes then. So when did you get married? How many kids do you have and how old are they now?
We got married in 2000. I have four kids, two boys and two girls. The boys are 22 and 20. The girls are 18 and 15.
Wow, you've been busy. Four kids, Matt. That's pretty ambitious. I mean, wow.
Yeah, we both always felt like we wanted a large family. I have to admit, after three, it was sort of like, well, this feels pretty good. And then it just sort of, the fourth one came along. And now, of course, you can't imagine life without her.
Of course, of course, of course. You have double the number of kids I have. I think Sam has two, right? Sam
Same
has
as
got two.
three.
Oh, Sam has three. Okay. And I know his kids are about the same age as mine. I have a 10.5-year-old daughter and a 7.5-year-old
Yeah, that's the right range. And then he's got one younger.
daughter. Okay. So I think he's probably asking a lot of the same questions of you that I'm asking right now as well. And it's just interesting that you mentioned this because I have been roped in by a local community organization that does presentations in schools out here in the Tri Valley, which is where I live in California right now. Um, I live in Pleasanton, which is about 40 miles east of San Francisco. It's where PeopleSoft was founded and where Workday is right
Sure.
now.
By the way, PeopleSoft was an investment at the first firm I was at, Norwest Venture Partners.
Okay.
That was an exciting company, obviously went public, and other things have spun out of it, like Workday and so on.
Totally. It's one of the big success stories, defining companies of that first era of big enterprise software.
Absolutely.
HR, HCM software, in some ways, is the obverse side of the coin of CRM software. So you have your customer software and then you have your employee software, the two sides of any organization. And that's why CRM software is so important because once you have a CRM system, it's very hard to take it out or change it, right?
It's very sticky.
It's literally the sort of system of record for your customer relationships and all of your revenue. On the other side of it, you have HCM and HR and all the processes and workflows that go around having employees, hiring employees, paying employees, benefiting employees, and everything else. So PeopleSoft basically kind of built Pleasanton, if I could be so bold to say, biggest employer here. Now Workday is the biggest employer. And anyway, I've kind of geeked out over the last 25 years in B2B enterprise software. And so that's my expertise. And just to kind of update you and the audience about where I'm coming from with all of this as a marketer and an IT guy, I joined this industry in the late 90s, right when you were investing. I was learning about computers for the first time. I'd been a history major at Wesleyan. I had gotten really interested in computers at my first job down in DC after college. And just kind of was amazed at what you could do with client server back in those days. And we had a Windows 3.1 desktop that we would use. And what would happen is in the middle of the day, everybody would be working. Imagine 500 associates working in various cubicles of the Watergate building in DC, because that's where I was. And all of a sudden the screen goes black and everyone starts looking around at each other like, what the hell just happened? I was working on a Word doc and everyone's like, oh my God, did I just lose all my work? Right. And so all of a sudden you hear this like PA announcement from IT that says, we've had a server failure and you guys should go home for the rest of the day because we're not getting this thing back up again. And so 500 people lost their work. And so whatever you were working on for that client was done and like fried, right? Yeah. And so it was those kinds of experiences before even like you started hearing about Yahoo and Amazon and so forth. Like those things were just starting.
Yeah.
They were literally just starting in 96, 95. I think we were very much analog kids coming out of college, analog in every way, analog, not knowing that, one day we would like literally have information, at the click of a button that would otherwise take us weeks to find in libraries and Dewey Decimal System and cards and so forth. Right. So it's a long way away from all of that to like parenting a kid now in the digital age and wondering how like a Sam or like myself have to deal with this problem. And this organization goes around and like tries to teach parents about the ills of smartphones. And so I went to one of these presentations and I started talking and asking lots and lots of questions, like an Exonian would do, kind of being like the loudest parent in the room, asking all these questions and sort of probing to find solutions for how do you parent your children, 7-year-old, 10-year-olds, when you've got bullying happening on the internet, you've got social media, you've got cell phones, you've got all these like apps and shows and subscriptions and you know you've got just weirdos out there like lurking on the internet trying to like prey on children and all kinds of things that are
Or
happening.
old people.
Or old people, exactly. Yeah, exactly. There is elder abuse that's very much happening because of
Rampant.
the high from technology. So all these like shitty things are happening, and so I ended up hooking up with this organization, and now I go and I talk to other parents in other schools about how we're trying to handle it. And so it's really cool to hear that Sam's coming to you to kind of find out what your experience was, because a lot of the people that are behind this organization are in the same boat as you. They have kids that are in their early 20s. They were somewhere around 2010, smartphones started coming out. Their kids wanted one. They just gave it to the kid. They didn't really think twice about it and they didn't know what would happen. But really, with social media and the confluence of social media, cheap mobile internet, and the smartphone starting in 2012, you have this terrible trend, right, of bullying and teen suicide and all kinds of bad stuff, right, with the basic timing of like mass
Well, and I'll
consumer.
say those are the more sort of recognizable
Mhm.
abuses. There are many that are much more subtle that affect an even broader audience, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it really is too bad. I mean, obviously, many things around technology and progress and so on are generally positive, but I think there are downsides, right? And just like with AI today, right, there are definitely risks if we're not thoughtful. And I think unfortunately, social media has been left largely unchecked. And I'm not saying it's all negative. Certainly there are positive aspects of social media, and there's many good stories and many good reasons why it exists. And it's probably helped a lot of people in many ways. And I can think of some, but I also think it's sort of been irresponsibly allowed to just kind of, you know, permeate through society and especially younger people in ways that are quite damaging. When our kids were that age and when this was brand new, our view was we picked an age, right? We sort of picked right before 13, 8th grade, right before high school. You're not going to get a phone until then. I don't know. It was a little arbitrary, but it sort of seemed to us like by high school, you're going to have this. Everybody does. And you probably need a little bit of time to kind of learn how to use it.
Mm-hmm.
I also sort of had a belief back then, perhaps naively, of like, this is just going to be something in your life that you're going to have to learn how to use. Right?
Right.
You're going to have to deal with it, which is true. But I in hindsight, obviously by the fourth child, we learned a lot and we handled it a little differently than we did with the first. But it really is, and this is probably the part that Sam and I have debated, me sort of saying, I think I hold Facebook and so on very accountable for, I don't know, just sort of being recklessly abusing the mental health of our young people.
Yeah.
In the same way that the tobacco industry did whatever, 40, 50, 60 years ago with cigarettes, knowing that it was hurting them, but continuing to do it. And I think the counter argument is, yeah, but there are no laws. They're not breaking any laws necessarily. And that's probably true. I don't know if it's 100% true, but I still, I don't know. That's where I guess, perhaps capitalism and, you know, things come into conflict. And that's why we actually need regulations and
Yeah.
laws and
Yeah.
so on. So
It's amazing that you think that. I feel the same way. I would love to just double click on this and understand your like specific experiences. Like what can you tell me about parenting? Sounds like your kids were basically born in roughly 2003, 2005, 2007, 2010. Is that
Yeah, pretty
correct?
close, pretty much.
Pretty close, yeah. Which means that with Facebook IPO happening in 2012, with mobile internet, cheap mobile internet happening around 2012, 2013, 2014 timeframe, your oldest kids were like 11, 10, 12, 11 years old right when this was happening. And for folks that are interested in this, there's a book by Jonathan Haidt called The Anxious Generation, which is the kind of text that people are pointing to these days to learn about the impact of this technology and social media, mobile and social media both, and smartphones on kids, very specifically the kids of your specific kind of time frame. So you really experienced it firsthand as parents. So what were you noticing with your oldest kids as well as you got as they got older, your
Well,
younger
yeah, I
kids?
mean, I guess what I would say at a high level, the two main things I noticed was one, sort of almost a level of addiction, even though we tried very much to manage and try to coach and try to moderate. And, and when we built a new house, it's in a place where there's lots of backyards and there's, a soccer net and like lots of reasons to be outside. And my kids did experience that. And we didn't have video games in the house and so on. So they certainly did experience a lot of the outdoors, but still, even with all of that and with us trying to be conscious about it, certainly for our first child, a level of addiction at times that was sort of like, my God. And if you have any form of attention deficit, ADHD or ADD or anything like that, even if it's mild, it would only exacerbate that, right? Because sort of the constant scrolling and, little dopamine hits and so on that you get from sort of seeing something that you recognize or someone liking something that you posted, or I'd say it made those things worse and harder. And then I would also say, especially for, it seems like, I'm sure it's bad for both. In my house, it was especially bad for girls on sort of the social side. And I would just notice mood change, right? Just like much worse mood if they've been on the phone for, just wasted, a few hours just blew by of like whatever, being on the phone. And then you'd get this sort of really, cranky, nasty version of your daughter versus the usual happy, pleasant version. And it was something that was hard at times to get them to sort of recognize. And I have to admit, it got to, you try to use, there's some interesting documentaries that have been made, things that try to look at this from more of a broader, and you sort of try to sit down and watch these with your kids and, they'd pay attention, but then they'd sort of be like, but I can't I can't not do this. And there were times where my older daughter would sort of delete some things, delete TikTok but then her friends were all using it and her friends were all talking about it. And it was just so much pressure to use those things again. My youngest has definitely learned the most by watching her siblings. And she's certainly the most, I'd say, responsible, or just sort of manages it really well and doesn't really let it sort of phase her. But it's a real challenge. Like, I actually don't think it's become a thing that kids and parents will fight about. It will cause, damage to the relationship potentially, at least for periods of time between children and parents. That's not good. We don't need any more of that. There's already enough difficult things to work through as a teenager, right?
Right. So what did you notice though? Okay, so you and I were teenagers together, right, in Webster. How did being a teenager change because of social media and smartphones and the internet?
I mean, it's just, FOMO to the extreme, right? You can see what everyone else is doing, and for whatever reason, they feel the need to post, whenever they're together. So you're like, oh, my friends are together and I'm not with them. They didn't tell me they were doing that. Or even if they did, I'm left out. Or, I mean, that's the most obvious and simple, but it's just like constant. And then there's, the fact that most people only post the parts of their lives that they want you to see on social, right? So you think that their lives are really good all the time and they look great all the time. And that's just not real. I don't know. It's again, none of it's done, I think, with malintent, but it ends up as en masse of sort of bringing out, I think, sort of the negative parts of humanity more than the positive parts. That's my perspective anyway.
Yeah, right. Well, you're dad of four kids. I mean, I think the perspective from being hands-on as a parent with kids that have been like right kind of in the bullseye of this timing between the early 2000s till now, you've seen kind of a massive transformation in the last 15 years.
Yeah.
So I worked at Palm in the early 2000s,
Oh,
early mid
really?
2000s.
Palm
Yeah,
Pilots.
I did. Yeah, I did.
I had one of those.
I know, right? So
Well,
okay,
probably
so for
everyone did for a little while, right?
yeah, yeah. So for folks that are listening, here's sort of historical context of the smartphone industry that helps to understand this as a parent dealing with, as you put it, Matt, the new tobacco. I mean, that is exactly what this is. And when I speak on this topic in front of other parents, and I just did at the Pleasanton Library last week, that's exactly what I called it. That's exactly what we're dealing with. And everything you described, trying to pry a piece of glass out of your kids' hands when they've been looking at an iPad for hours on Netflix or Prime Video or doing games or messaging their friends, which is becoming a new thing here in this household. You do notice they turn into like the Tasmanian devil. They won't give it up. They turn into like their worst tantrumist little selves, and it causes a huge amount of friction with us. I have to ask them 10 times, first to give it back to me before they ever will. And it definitely is one of the central kind of challenges of parenting right now in this age group for us and for pretty much everybody else.
Well, I think so. I think so. Yeah.
Right. And the kind of damage it's doing to their self-esteem, especially for young girls, unfortunately, is very real. So I think of it as definitely the new tobacco that we're now dealing with as a public health crisis that's gone unregulated. And probably like the tobacco industry, they know it's bad. They know what they're building and putting to market is bad for kids. They know it. They have the research and the data that
They do.
make them completely aware that what they're doing is creating an addiction in these young people because they get paid for it.
Yeah. Well, exactly. There's plenty of incentives, and I don't know. For me, that's where it's sort of, I don't, as Sam said, I don't think they're breaking any laws, but I think they're doing things that are very
Well, they have such a hand in setting the laws,
yeah,
and that's why they're not
especially
breaking.
boy. So you just jumped right into some modern times, didn't you? With what's going on in the government today.
Right. Yeah, the tech oligarchs and Australia recently passed a law that said if you're under 16, you have no social media access.
Yeah, no, I think China started to control it more too. And that's what I mean. I think that, we need things to help parents, right? We need actual laws, we need regulations, we need real guidance to help parents. Because otherwise, it's just such a negative point of friction in families.
I hate to put it this way, but it's like putting a cigarette in your 9-year-old's mouth right now. That's the same thing as what's happening.
Well, and just so with our youngest, who's now 14, 15, recently turned 15, we did make her sign sort of like a contract, right? And she had more appreciation because she'd watched her older siblings, right? And so we were sort of saying, we actually sat down with her and we're like, this is why we want to put these sorts of controls in place. This is what we're worried about. This is what we're trying to make sure doesn't happen to you. And I think it was a little more real for her just because she'd seen it in the household, right? Versus just like, some parent trying to tell you things that aren't tangible. You've never seen them. You've never witnessed them. They just sort of sound like, don't play in the street. It was a little easier for that last one because she'd actually seen it over years.
Right.
So I don't know. I mean, not that that's a solution. So just have lots of kids. The last one will actually appreciate it.
Great solution. Yeah, I have lots of kids, so the last one figures it out. Okay, well, I have some questions on this, and then we can get into investing in a minute. But this is like such an important topic. I'm actually glad you brought it up. This anxious generation issue is important. Jack Herney, when I interviewed him for this podcast, actually told me that the book by Jonathan Haidt, The Anxious Generation, was the required text for this past academic year of all faculty at Exeter.
That's good.
I can't imagine in a boarding school environment what this is like. To have 1,000 cell phones walking around campus, documenting the grill or the gym or
I can
something.
tell you what it's like as a parent who is not at the boarding school but nearby and whose kids have gone there.
Okay.
Just so you know, and again, let's not go down this tunnel. But I had one child go to Andover, suffer, unfortunately have to deal with COVID through most of it and got out the other side, but I certainly didn't enjoy a lot of it. And then I had another child who was 3 years younger, and they overlapped for 1 year.
Mhm.
And then the older, my son graduated, went off to college. Halfway through my daughter's sophomore year, she left. She just did not like it. And it had nothing to do with academics. It all had to do with sort of social pressures and the intensity of the culture and the lip service given to mental health, but not
Mhm.
actually caring about mental health. At least that's how it felt to us very much. So she left. She went to public school. She's much happier.
Was she a day student or a boarder?
Her first year, she was a day student because her brother could drive her. Her second year, she lived on campus.
And how far are you from there? About a half hour, 45 minutes or something?
From Andover,
Yeah.
I'm about 12 minutes.
Really?
It's very close. I, in fact,
Oh,
play
wow.
hockey there on Friday mornings before work.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So even with that, though, it was better for her to be a boarder there than.
It's one of those things where generally I think at a boarding school, it's better to board.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I know what you mean. Different
I think
experience.
some kids are happy. Her older brother was definitely better off as a day student. He kind of needed that structure.
Yeah. Yeah.
She's very independent, and she was fine as a boarder. I think she'll do great in college next year,
Right.
but just not in that culture.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, and I don't fault you whatsoever for sending your kid to Andover. I think Andover's a great school, so I wouldn't give you
Well,
shit
my
for
wife
that.
went there.
Oh, your wife went to Andover?
Yes, and her best friend was the dean of students. She's now moved on to a different school, but we knew a ton of people there. Maddie
Right.
Lees is there, right? There's a lot of great
Yeah.
people at the school.
Of course. John Palfrey was running it.
That's right. John Palfrey was there for the first part of my son's time there, and then
Yeah.
he
Well,
left.
it's almost like two different versions of the same institution. I
Well,
mean,
there's
to
a
me,
lot of similarities and there's a lot of differences, and this is why maybe we say this. I loved my time at Exeter, Vivek. Our time in Webster, our time in the classrooms, and everything. Other than the sort of adjustment for me moving back from the UK and going straight to an American boarding school, which was definitely an adjustment. Once I got through that, it was generally a wonderful experience, lifelong friends. And I think my wife similarly had a very positive experience for herself at Andover. But our kids, who we thought were like ideal candidates, neither of them have enjoyed it. And I don't know if Andover's just that different enough from Exeter that it was a different type of it, or if those schools overall have changed a lot. I know some of our classmates have kids who've now gone to Exeter or other boarding schools, and it would be interesting to sort of compare notes.
Yeah.
So good, because I had the most. I have a lot of love and a lot of very, very positive memories and a lot of appreciation. But I do wonder today, given how the world's gotten that much smaller, sort of the pressures are different, that, everything's very public because of social media. But, if the stress level that's now associated with these institutions, isn't almost at a level where it's unhealthy. I'm sure there are still students that thrive, right, that do amazingly well. And I saw that at Andover. It's not like all of these kids hated it. Certainly not.
Right.
It was just sort of surprising to me that our kids, it wasn't for them.
It's so interesting that that's, and yeah, it's surprising to me as well. I didn't know your wife had actually gone to Andover.
And we still managed to figure it out in college.
Exactly. Actually, it's funny. One of my best friends, he went to Andover too, and it hardly ever comes up. It's like not an issue. It's like not even a.
No, of course not.
Everything.
In many regards, they're very, very similar people, right?
That's true. Exactly. No, it's just fascinating to me because you would think the DNA is so ingrained that this would be like a slam dunk, and I'm sorry that it wasn't, that they experienced difficulty, but that just speaks to the whole mystery of parenthood and children and having kids, right? They just are what they are. They come out the way they come out. Nature, nurture, what ratio of it is that for your kid? For one kid, it's this ratio. For another kid, it's something else. It's almost like there's no rules. You can't overgeneralize. Each one is its own special project. But since we're on this, let me ask you, so are you kind of from a big Exeter family? I wasn't sure because I know your cousin in Dunbar, right? She was there when we were there.
Yeah, so yes and no. No one in my immediate family, but I had a number of cousins. Alexandra Galston, or Alex Galston, she was in Dunbar. She was a couple years ahead of us. She was wonderful, right, when I was looking at the school and showed me all around. And I had another cousin named Nick Shields who lived in Main Street. He was a year ahead of us. He and I had a lot of fun, both in high school and college together. His older brother also went there. And then after me, Alex's Galston's younger brothers both came through, Jay and Matt. So, yes, so there was a lot of foot, and we had a grandfather, right, who had gone through many, many years ago when it was. So there certainly were family members, cousins, and so on that had been there. So I'd been hearing about Exeter for a fairly long time before I got.
Yeah. Yeah. And so did that contribute to kind of like a familiarity and a knowingness of it that you would have expected maybe your kids would kind of like inherit some of that?
Yeah. Yeah. No, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, they certainly were aware. And listen, another one of them, our youngest is at Brooks today, the Brooks School. It's a smaller school. It's a little just dialed back a hair. She's loving it so far. So
Yeah.
we'll see.
Well, you can't like project your own stuff on your kid, right? Isn't that
Really shouldn't. It's something that we learned the hard way, I think. You really shouldn't do that. It's probably only going to come back to burn you later. They are their own independent, complex humans. They are not
really
you.
Yeah, they really are.
Yeah.
Yeah, they really are. In fact, the less I try to understand, the better. The more I try to accept just it is what it is, don't reason with it. Try to find like the logic underlying my daughter's behavior. It does not work. It really doesn't. I'm actually really glad that we're having this conversation, bro. Obviously when we started this out, we were going to talk more like kind of shop talk, and we still can. And I think there's a really big audience out there for understanding what VCs think, how they think, and what they do, and what do they, invest in, and how do they make those decisions, and how do they look at things. I actually have a deep interest in that myself. But this subject of parenting in the digital age, and then
we can, if you want to sort of move into modern times, like AI, right, is starting to really permeate the modern world, and it's finding its way onto your smartphones, right? It's finding its way on certainly into, business applications and school applications. And so this is the next wave of technology that we're going to have to figure out how to deal with as people, as parents, as professionals, etc. Right?
Oh my God, man. Matt, I definitely want to talk about that. And just before we kind of shift to AI, if I may, what advice do you have for Sam and for parents like me with young kids? What would you do different with smartphones and social media and the internet? What did you learn?
I just think my advice would be really intentional around it. Have a really real conversation, a very real conversation with your children. It's sort of like maybe when they learn to drive, right? This thing's a really dangerous thing. You could kill other people driving this vehicle if you do it the wrong way. You could really hurt yourself, right? You have to get a license. You have to take classes, right? You have to do all this stuff. I don't know about classes, but I think there's definitely having a very real conversation with your kids around sort of power that's being put into their hand with one of these smartphones, and the pros, the good parts, and then the cons, like the downsides. Mm-hmm. And maybe, I don't know if you go so far as to make them sign a contract, but sort of the contract for us was like, if we ever feel like you're abusing this, we could take it away. We can put, strict controls on it. We can, right. We're going to agree to this now. Right. And if you manage it well, we won't. But, if there are issues, you've agreed that we can do that.
Yeah.
So I want to get like that. Just making sure they know, like, this is something that scares us, and there's very good reason. And we want to have a open sort of, I don't know, adultish conversation with you about it.
And are they able to do that? And at what age do you think they're able to?
Well, so we did that at 13. And I think it helped a lot. I wouldn't say it's the panacea. I mean, it does certainly, doesn't solve all the problems for sure.
Right. And what are some of the ground rules you believed in that worked? And what are some of the things that you tried that didn't work?
Well, for example, I think it's great for communicating. I think it's great for making plans, right? It's certainly fine for looking up information, but we tried to limit sort of the amount of time spent on things like Instagram and TikTok and sort of the doom scrolling. There's no way you're going to keep them off of Snapchat. That's how all kids communicate. But just sort of part of the talk was like, you're going to see your friends doing stuff and you're not with them. And it's okay. No one gets invited to everything, right? And just, it's still going to make them feel crappy when it happens to them, but at least preparing them for that, for it a little bit mentally. I don't know. Those were the sorts of things that.
Is it fair to say that all the awkward things that happen as you're growing up as a teenager are amplified through that screen
Of course.
and made bigger and more pronounced? And that's sort of where the.
Well, they can be, or you get the really sort of fake plastic version of everyone, right?
Okay. Right. Okay. And then did you notice any difference between the way it affected your boys versus the way it affected your girls?
Yeah, it's definitely, there's definitely difference. Girls are just well, I mean, I don't want to generalize, but I will. Our girls, they mature faster. They just do. They're more aware of a lot of things a lot sooner. So I think there's obviously good things about that, but there's difficult things about that too.
Do you mean that they were able to handle the responsibility better than your boys did?
Yes,
Quicker
that's
at a
probably
younger age?
true to some degree,
Okay.
but it's also they're more sensitized and more aware of what other people are doing, and it seems to matter to them more. I'm sure there are some boys where that's also true. For our girls, they were more.
Right.
I'm not saying it didn't impact our son like that. It just wasn't as. It was.
Yeah. What about rules? What rules, ground rules did you set in terms of like, did you put tools that helped
Yeah,
you
I mean, I
monitor?
definitely would advise putting. There are some modern tools that allow you to sort of. I mean, I think you got to trust your kids to some degree. You've got to let them become independent. I mean, one of the other topics you could talk about as parents is letting your kids fail and make mistakes, and you got to do it. You got to do it early so that when it gets bigger, when they're older, it doesn't crush them. But you got to allow them that freedom to make mistakes, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So, but if they did, right, we then had some controls where we could turn down the amount of time, and they sort of, again, because we talked about it, they sort of understood and they say, "Hey, Dad, could I get an extra half an hour? I actually need to finish some homework. This is why." And on that night, we could say, "Okay," right? And then they'd sort of the time would go away. We'd give them back the full permission, and we'd sort of see how it would go from there.
Did you
There's
create like
limits you could put on certain apps, right? You can only use so much. And I think especially in the beginning days of 13, like having some of those controls is probably a good idea. I love that my daughter's boarding school basically has rules where you're not allowed to walk around campus with your phone in front of your face. You're not allowed to use your phone in the dining hall, right? I just love that. So the kids are actually, their heads up. They're looking around. They're saying hi, right? They go into the dining hall. They're having lunch with friends. They're not staring at their phones, right? So they've imposed this, but this is new. Like this is something they've learned in the last year or two to make, kids are allowed to use it in their room. Certainly they're probably allowed to use it like, if they're towards the end of the day or after sports or whatever activities. So they get plenty of it, but it's sort of restricted in ways that I respect.
Right. Yeah. But like, did you find that like there was like a 2 hour limit worked or was it a 1 hour?
Yeah. I mean, like how much TV would you want your kid watching every day? I mean,
yeah. So is that the way to think about
well,
this?
I mean, to some degree, that was when we were kids, right? Your parents would be like, you get an hour of television. It's sort of along those lines. Maybe it's an hour you start with, right? And if they're really good and responsible, you sort of, can dial it up a little bit from there. If you start to see a negative effect, you're like, yeah, seemed like an hour was good for you.
Did taking it away ever serve as a kind of punishment as well?
Yeah, but I just, that's not going to be fun. But yeah.
Yeah. So you tried that.
I will tell you, one of the best things, Vivek, was going on vacation where phones didn't work, right? Like I would specifically we'd go on a week-long river rafting trip in Idaho. And, you could use your phone as a camera, I guess, for as long as the battery lasted. But then it was just something that might break after that. And, after a day or so, they didn't even notice. Like it was just back to being a regular kid and having fun and being totally present, being totally with everyone on that trip. And it was wonderful.
Katie and you though, like, are you guys addicted to your phones? Like I am? Are
I
you?
am not addicted to my phone. I would throw it out the window, but I will admit I am probably at times it takes me a few days to turn off like work email, right? For me,
Right.
it's other things,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
probably some of the same mental patterns or sort of habits, right, that are going on with our kids. But for me, I usually find that it's not until like day 3 of a vacation that I actually start to let go of
Yeah.
all of
Sure.
that energy and need to respond to stuff and et
For
cetera.
sure. For sure. For sure. But like in terms of being a model to your children, in terms of behaviors and usage, though, was that something that you had to dial down? Like, oh my God, I'm doing this at the dining table. I
Yeah, we
gotta like,
don't. There's no phones at dinner tables at home. That's
okay.
still a rule,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
We don't get
Yeah.
everyone to have dinner together every night anymore, which is too bad. But that just Jack's at college, Sasha's at boarding school, Callie is senior year in high school, but she's also has a job and she's also a coach for little kids to play sports. So
Yeah.
just we don't always get to do it, but Sunday's usually the night where we have most of the family together, and there's certainly no phones
Yeah.
at the table.
Makes sense. I mean, there's a need for ground rules, some kind of monitoring, some sort of tamping down on limits, setting limits is what I'm hearing from you, managing it like it's sort of like television was when we were kids, and having a
It
real
is funny to think
conversation.
our parents probably, they watched us watch like MTV, and they watched us, play shoot 'em up video games, which were becoming popular when we were young. And they were sort of like, oh my God, it's ruining today's youth. So I have asked myself a number of times, is that just what's going on here? Is it just this is our generation sort of judging? But no, I actually think there's been enough, not just anecdotal evidence, but like real studied evidence that this causes mental health problems.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, all you have to do is go to City Arts and Lectures online on YouTube and pull up the Jonathan Haidt presentation. He gives an hour-long synopsis of his book, and he shows you the data that shows the correlation between depression and teen suicide, and the rise of social media on smartphones. And there's a connection there, and that's why it is, this generation's tobacco. And I'm very concerned as a parent, and I appreciate you being kind of a good 10, 12, if not a little bit more years ahead of me on this parenting journey, and having gone through it. And everybody that I work with on this group called Teen Esteem, they were in the same boat where these phones just showed up and their kids really wanted them. And so they just bought it and said, okay, here you go. And they didn't think twice about it. And then as they went through it, they discovered all the negative effects and the addiction and the social pressures and, all the issues that you've described and more. And they were like, oh my God, what have I done? And they were giving kids this stuff when they were in 5th grade, right? And that's when they realized there were like a brewing kind of storm of issues here. And so you think also just the way that the way America had like Zuckerberg on Time magazine, right, as sort of man of the year at one point, as this champion of this whole new media phenomenon, right, as like the hero for having invented and kind of pioneered this like incredible, amazing, new, positive, wonderful thing called social media. Like that was 10, 15 years back now. And I think the whole mood around that has flipped the other way. It's,
Yeah, no, and I do think about that. I mean, you think about what was it was called like the summer, right? There was sort of the person who set themselves on fire, right? And posted on social media in
right. You mean in the Middle East,
yeah,
in the
it wasn't
Arab
Syria. I
Spring,
can't remember which.
Tunisia?
Is it Tunisia?
Is that what you're talking about? The
Well,
Arab Spring?
yeah, the sort of Arab Spring, right, where you had these different countries
Yeah.
leveraging things like Facebook to
Okay.
communicate and to rise up and
Right.
right. I mean, to me, that was one of the big positives of it, right? But I just think it's also done so much damage on the other side, and that's where for me, it's kind of crossed the line where I actually think it's done more bad than good.
I think you're right.
Um,
Yeah, I think you're right. And so
and I
both
do
of
look
you
at
and I,
Zuckerberg, and I'm like, I can't believe this Exonian is being so reckless with young people's health. But he's not, he's playing by the rules, I think, but he's in my opinion not adhering to human decency.
a lot of those executives don't let their own kids have this stuff.
There you go.
Yeah. The president of Pinterest had left Facebook for Pinterest, or no, I think he was at Google, and then he went to Pinterest to teach Pinterest how to do what Google did, was to monetize traffic. And there's a documentary on, I believe it's on Netflix, about this, where he was like, I'm like so addicted, I can't stop looking
Yeah,
at
no,
this
I've
stuff.
seen, that's one of the ones we sat and watched with our kids.
You know what? I think that's a good piece
The
of
Social
advice, right?
Dilemma or something.
Social Dilemma. That's probably like if there was a list of things to kind of do, that would be watch that
Yeah,
with your kid.
that's certainly a good one. But just remember, your kids are gonna, even if they want the phone badly, and this is part of the contract of getting it, they will roll their eyes a little at you. I mean, it's just, it's gonna happen.
We did this to our parents about other stuff,
Yep.
I think, didn't we? And that's what's weird about it. Really appreciate you sort of teaching us about this from your experience today.
I'm just one parent. I'm sure it would be really interesting to talk to a lot of our classmates who have been through this too.
For me, like these conversations hopefully are about teaching people something new that, your classmate has gathered as expertise over the last 30 years that's sort of unique and fun and interesting, the way Megan did around her work in grief, like, which is extremely important. It's like kind of mind blowing how critical and important it is and how innovative her approach also is. So it's not just the typical stuff, but it's a rethinking, of that topic. And when we talked about what we would do in our episode, we talked about, well, teach me about VC and tech investing. I want to learn all about how you think about this. And I know there are a bunch of little, Exonian entrepreneurs, sitting in Webster and Abbott and, who knows where on campus right now, coding up the next great app, because that's what they do now over at Exeter, right? That for years now, there've been.
I think for a lot of them, my advice would be go get a real job, go experience the real world, and then figure out a real problem to solve. Because
That's right.
what do you know when you're in high school or at Exeter?
Well,
I mean,
I know,
some of them, I say that glibly, but some of them are probably quite worldly and sophisticated. But there was certainly a period where a lot of people coming out of undergrad, starting companies, the joke was they were automating things that your mom used to do for you.
I love
Right.
that.
And it's sort of like,
Is this what you guys say to each other, like when the door is closed?
yeah, exactly. It's sort of like, having operated you mostly in sort of the, what we call the B2B world, where you're selling into businesses or dealing more with businesses, you generally have to go experience the business world to figure out a problem worth solving in the business world with technology. Whereas if you've only been in school, it's mostly going to be social and consumer and, those sorts of things that you're focused on as an art. Now, again, there are certainly exceptions, right? There are people who, for whatever reason, figure something out earlier.
Luck, that's
Certainly
luck.
there's a lot of luck, right? It's always better to be lucky than good. Hey,
Yeah,
if you
yeah.
want to do sort of some rapid fire, just sort of venture stuff, fire away, and I'll try to give you quick.
I would love to do that. So here's how I would frame it, though. So if you think about the conversation that you and I have been having around concerned parents for the health of our children and for this whole generation of kids and parents, what they're dealing with now in the 2020s as the result of this entire technology revolution that's happened since let's mark it to 93, okay? Because that is when Yahoo was founded. So you're 32 years away now from, let's say, the very beginnings of the internet. But so much has changed since we went through Exeter in college. So much has like fundamentally changed about how we live our lives. Everything from how we date to how we get groceries to how we get takeout to how we file an expense report. Every workflow process in a business and every consumer process has been completely transformed by the internet. And now where it's now like a thing you're managing for your kids, like well-being and health, right? Like that's how different a place we're in. And here we are now, 2 years since ChatGPT was released. What the hell is happening here?
We got pretty overheated, right? In 2020, 2021, we've been building up a massive momentum and kind of growth cycle in technology for like 10, 12 years.
Yeah.
Right. And so the economy then slowed down a bunch, right? Around the same time, 2022, 2023.
Yeah.
I wouldn't put that all on AI.
Okay.
Some of that's just it's kind of correcting for sort of the end of a hype cycle.
And the pandemic had some impact as
Yeah,
well, right?
the pandemic boosted a lot of things digitally, right? Or
Yeah.
boosted a lot of digital stuff because we were all at home. We were online more. We couldn't interact with people face to face, so we were doing it more on the computer. Everyone bought Pelotons. It seemed like a lot of those things kind of, to some degree, got full saturation. And then as the post-pandemic, sort of has waned and people have gone back to, I don't think they haven't fully gone back to, because look, you and I are having this conversation. You're in California, I'm in Massachusetts, and it's very natural. Pre-pandemic, that would not have been the case. But, I'd say that's also probably created some of the hangover effect within the
Okay.
technology world.
You went from, internet to mobile, to cloud and SaaS, and then now you have all of a sudden you have AI, right? So like each new wave is like completely changed the game. So now how is AI changing the game? And like what are you doing now in terms of how you look at AI, not only as an investor, but just as a person sort of living through it as well?
Yeah. Well, again, I'll do the quick. So just AI has been around as a term and a concept and sort of a pursuit since the mid 50s.
Hmm.
It's gone through a number of what they would call sort of winners, where people would get all excited about it, and then it kind of would disappoint. It wouldn't live up to those expectations, and it would sort of fall off for a while. Right? Neural networks, I think, were first discussed and originally promoted, I think, in the early 90s, but then really weren't used to do anything useful for probably almost 15 years. And then finally, we had this kind of breakthrough. I think it was 2016 when the Go game that I think DeepMind had built beat a grandmaster. Right, very, very complex game, far more complex than chess, where a computer was trained by having two different versions play each other millions of times, right? And in doing so, learned strategies that humans had never contemplated, and then beat a human using that strategy. That did feel notable, but I don't think the weird thing is, like, that was for the nerds. That was for like the tech world took note and been like, oh, that's interesting. But I don't think the general population really cared a whole lot or took note.
Hmm.
It wasn't until a few years later when people then carried kind of some of the things that were learned in that approach forward, the transformer paper that researchers at Google's put together. And that eventually led to, sort of the founding of OpenAI, and then, ChatGPT. And then sort of all of a sudden people waking up and being like, holy cow, like this thing actually writes pretty good text. And all of a sudden AI is here. But I give that quickly to sort of say it's been building in sort of these hot and cold waves for decades. And now it's just reached the point where it's really kind of on everyone's mind all the time. Yeah, I mean, I live in this now, right? I joined a fund called InnoSpark Ventures in Boston about 3.5 years ago. It was founded by two very, very experienced, very successful people, who are, one's a technologist and operator, one was a tremendous investor. And then they sort of brought me in to help run this for them. It's awesome because I don't have to raise capital. Most people in venture capital every few years have to raise the next fund and so on. I don't have to worry about that, which is a giant luxury and a huge advantage. And so we really do just focus on making investments and then working with our companies. And it's all about machine learning and AI and data science and so on.
So is that your focus now?
100%
Okay.
across different sectors, across business, life sciences, healthcare. We used to do a little education. A lot of it's pretty techy, what we're doing. There's a lot of fairly
Okay.
technical founders that we work with. But fundamentally, we're not just investing in technology. We are going after problems. Like, we're working with people who understand specific problems very well,
Yeah.
and are applying modern AI to it. From a philosophical standpoint, I'm very excited about AI in the future and a lot of the good things that I think it will do. I do think, just like with anything else, we have to be conscious about how we use it and sort of the rules and the guidelines that we set up and so on. I will also say, though, that people should be conscious that the tech industry has grown dramatically, right? And the venture industry has grown dramatically too. When I got into it, right, it was probably, I don't know, a couple hundred firms.
Hmm.
And, the number of investments they were making was a lot smaller. It is now a gigantic industry. The percentage of the economy that is now run by private companies is much, much, much larger. Much, much, much larger. There's half the number of public companies as there used to be. There's a lot more private equity. There's a lot more venture capital. And the venture capital firms, the big ones, are gigantic. In fact, many of them don't even call themselves venture capital anymore. They're more asset managers. Now, it is in their best interest to market to the world that like technology is exciting, because that way people give them more money to invest in new technology. So I just think, just like with anything else these days that we hear in the media and the news, you've got to take all of that with a grain of salt. And so when you have, whether it's Sam Altman or the head of Andreessen Horowitz or whoever telling you that AI is going to do these amazing things in just a few years, they're selling you something, right? Just remember, like that will benefit them. There are also some very smart people who have spent many, many years in this space who will say, we haven't figured it out yet, right? These current models, these LLMs, they're not going to get us all the way to like real intelligence, right? They're doing some really cool stuff and they're helping us in this next phase of automation, just like software. They're helping us automate more things that we couldn't automate previously. And if you want, I can talk to you about some of the cool stuff that like some of our companies are doing across healthcare and life sciences and so on, that we feel fits very well with the capabilities of AI today, right? But as far as like matching human intelligence, in a broad sense, that still feels pretty far away. We don't even know how the human brain works very well. Another tangent I could go off on is like, why do we want to recreate human intelligence necessarily? Like that's actually imperfect. We make mistakes all the time, right? We are not super intelligent. We are not infallible. I hold computers generally to a much higher standard, right? They need to be right. They need to be correct.
That's true. That's right.
Whereas when there are a lot of mistakes, people do say, well, it's human. Yeah, because we make mistakes. I would prefer computers to not make mistakes. So this whole hallucinations thing to me is like not acceptable. These LLMs, these AIs that kind of make up stuff and don't understand fact from fiction, to me, that's not acceptable.
Some marketer somewhere made that more socially acceptable by calling it hallucination, when it's just an error. It's an
error.
It's bad software.
It's basically a judgment. I mean, so these models today are probabilistic, right? They're based on probabilities. They're based on pattern matching. Yeah. But there are many things in life that are deterministic, and they just don't. They don't compute. They don't fully understand fact and fiction. Even though they're giving you the most probable answer, it's not always the right answer, right? Some percentage of the time, by definition, it's going to be at the long end of the tail. It's going to be the 2, 3, 4% versus the 96%.
Right. Yeah. Well, talk to me about what you are investing in and what you think is viable. You mentioned that there are some things you're seeing and doing that look good to you across these sectors. Maybe another time we'll have a different kind of deep dive on sort of Boston VC versus Silicon Valley VC and some of the sort of larger questions that young entrepreneurs have about what you're looking for when you're investing. I have questions like, is it the founder or is it the idea? Is it the pain point problem sort of issue that you're focusing on, or is it the person who you're investing in, right? Those kinds of things. But like, I think for where we are right now, it'd be great for you to tell us, like, what do you think is actually happening, what you're actually putting your own money around that works for you?
Sure. Well, I'll tell you, people are certainly the most important part of all this, but there's a lot of other parts too. Mm-hmm. There's very few people who, if they came up to me and said, I want to do a new startup, I'd just give them a blank check, right? There might be a few, but it's a pretty small list. I don't know. I mean, some of the stuff we're working on, drug discovery, making it easier instead of having this sort of expensive, long lab-driven process, right? That's not going to go away, but you can compress it and make it less expensive by applying computation to it, right? And finding drugs for different types of cancer or other rare diseases and so on. Like, I think this is going to be accelerated with AI, right? And again, you're still going to need both sides of it. Growing things in biomaniufacturing, we're an investor in a company that's bringing analytics and AI to that so that you can actually get much higher yields, and you can catch, if it starts to degrade, you catch that sooner. Designing new alloys, designing new materials, right? They're making it much, much, much cheaper. So we think people will do a lot more of it. Today, it's very expensive. It takes a long time. Matching patients to clinical trials, right? Clinical trials often fail because they don't find enough patients to validate, the thesis, to prove that the drug works enough. But that's because today it's trained people. They're usually not full physicians, but they might be, medical records folks who read these, or nurses and so on, or you have a primary physician who's overseeing a study at a hospital, and they're working in collaboration with a pharmaceutical company. They're trying to find patients. They're asking doctors. It's just a very imperfect system. And, humans are only so good at focusing on so many things at one time. Whereas if you have a computer that's constantly watching every patient, it's just going to source more. It's going to find more patients that reach these clinics.
I'm going to be talking to Marshall. He's developing a drug as we speak, and he's going to tell us all about what it means to do drug discovery. He's sort of on the third phase of this process of putting a drug out to market.
Awesome.
Yeah. So I bet what you're talking about would have been germane to him to accelerate, like take a year or two off.
Well, yeah. So there's the process of actually discovering the drug, right? But then there's all the other pieces around bringing it to market, right? That you can also apply greater degrees of automation to. And then once you get to market, there's intelligence around who should you be talking to? Which doctor should you be focusing on? Which patients should you be trying to talk to? Versus just sort of like running these horrible ads during football games, right? So everyone has to hear about diseases they don't have, right? Why not just talk to the people that actually make
what
sense?
You're describing sounds a lot like the previous versions of innovation. You're just doing it with bigger data sets and with I don't know, a greater level of automation using AI now.
A lot more accuracy. You're certainly doing some things that you previously were somewhat insurmountable without where sort of these models are today.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Oh, there's stuff in the legal field. There's stuff. One of the neat companies, I will say that because we have just one large investor, and because that large investor is a foundation, and they focus on education, climate, democracy, and breakthrough medical research, it does allow us to focus on AI for good. All right. Nice. And to really focus more on companies that we think are really beneficial to society versus just making money. I wouldn't say we're an impact investor, but it's something that we think a lot about as we pick which companies we're really going to focus on. One of them, it's now a Boston company called Marigold Health, right? And what it's basically doing is bringing peer-to-peer support in a digital way. I think we've all learned that things like Alcoholics Anonymous is a great way for people to get support from peers, get support from other people in recovering from alcohol abuse. Marigold tries to bring those same principles, but to do it in through a digital interface, whether it's a computer or a phone or whatever, so that you can interact with people all the time if you need the support. And it uses the AI to elevate those cases that are the most serious to an actual healthcare provider, not just a peer. And they're going into initially these, capitated models where there's a risk-bearing entity that's providing the healthcare. So they clearly have an incentive to keep you healthy, right? Because it will cost them more if you get sick. And that's where they're just seeing really impressive results. And they're only in a couple of states so far, but they're keeping people out of the emergency room. They're keeping them healthier. It's saving the system money. It's really working. And so it's pretty cool to get to be associated and connected to entrepreneurs working in that.
Nice. Yeah. I'm just having looked at your website. It's remarkable. I think what you're mostly into really is healthcare and life sciences out there, right?
Well, I would say that's about half of what we do. Boston is very strong, right, in both of those categories, healthcare and life sciences. Not that we only invest in Boston. It's just that there's a lot of really smart people in those fields here. Mm-hmm. But we've also done a fair amount of, materials, and we have one at utilities that basically is trying to help utilities find all the places they're losing water, right? Water leaks. That's probably going to become a increasingly hard problem as the world continues to heat up. We've got others that are doing things I guess it's dentistry. One that you can wear headphones, Beef, and it will read your brain waves and tell you if you're losing focus or fatigued or, you know, you need to take a break, right?
Wow.
And eventually and this is just through some headphones. Eventually they get more and more people using it. They get more data. They've shown us where you can actually think next song and it will advance,
Really? Oh my God.
the, you know, to the next song. You don't even have to look at your phone. So it's, you know, you'd call sort of a brain computer interface, BCI, but there's no electrodes or anything being implanted in you.
Yeah, isn't that what Elon Musk is trying to do? Is like put a chip in your brain or
Yes,
something?
yes.
Like,
One of his
where you can
companies,
basically.
one of Neuralink, one of his companies, you're putting a chip in the brain. Now, to be fair, I think I don't know what their long-term plans are because I'm not involved in the company, but I believe their initial use cases are very medically oriented, where people have lost control of things, and that to me actually makes some sense.
Right.
I'm not sure that, you know, general public wants to have a chip implanted in their brain.
I guess no, I don't think so. But if you're already injured,
Yeah, if you've lost use of one of your limbs or something, and this is going to help you control a
yeah,
robotic version, or that starts to be interesting.
right, right, yeah, exactly, exactly. Man, that's pretty cool. It's really neat that you're able to do this kind of work. It sounds like a lot of fun. It sounds like you're free as well to do it in a way with some of the constraints of typical VC sort of released from you. So, in other words, is it one funder for this whole thing? Like, tell
Yes,
me
it's
about
one
that.
large foundation that funds everything, and we invest, you know, a certain amount every 4 years or so, and then we'll have a new fund, and but it's just one large limited partner.
Wow, good for you. This is really fun. So listen, I feel like I'm gonna have some edits to do on this, but because I thought we were gonna talk for like 45 minutes, and just like do like the like nerding out on VC and investing, and we hardly scratched the surface on that. So will you like come back some other time and maybe we can
Sure.
go deeper?
Yeah. No, if you think
Yeah,
people want to hear about the sort of more
yeah,
standard, you know, perspective of a VC and how that, you know, what we look for and how you raise capital and all that stuff, happy to do that.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think there's a lot of people out there that are interested in that, and there might be one or two other folks, right, in our network that we pull in a conversation like that to make it,
Sure.
broader potentially. But just what we discussed about the waves of change and how it's become a parenting problem.
Yeah. That was a big section of today, was it?
Like that actually is like extremely important and meaningful.
I hope you, I hope you, because you're a few years behind, can benefit from the mistakes that those of us who are a few years ahead have made.
Yeah. Well, we're trying, and unfortunately, I think it's kind of like people probably in the 40s used to smoke, and I think there were ads out there about how it helps you breathe better. I mean, that's kind of
So
the
that's
best.
when I was making my points around people are selling you something. That's exactly what I was referring to.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess that's one thing. The CEO of Google says that this is the most important human invention since fire. Like, what do you think when you hear that stuff about
I
AI?
mean, that's, you know, that's just marketing. I mean, that's just getting people. How do you judge that? More important than electricity, right? I mean, more important than, I don't know. That seems,
Right, right,
it's a big
right.
deal in that, you know, it's taking over pieces of what humans do in some ways. It's automating more of our lives. But we've been pursuing, as I said, we've been pursuing this for like 60, 70 years. We're on a journey, right? And there may still be quite some time before it's at a point where it is truly transformational, where it's more than just automating things to the next degree.
Right.
I'm not a believer in folks that say we're like 2 or 3 years away from AGI, this sort of, you know,
With that.
I hear that and I'm like, oh, it's just more marketing crap, right?
Sure.
I don't know if, you know, and what is AGI and like, why does it even matter? But we are definitely, I will say technology is advancing more rapidly as time goes by. And so probably in our lifetimes, we will see something that is sort of another order of magnitude more sophisticated. In it.
Yeah. Do you use any specific set of tools in your day-to-day work now, AI tools? What do you use?
I use the deep research tools from Google and ChatGPT when I'm trying to get to know a company, like at the beginning of the process. It's very helpful to sort of basically quickly go out and summarize an internet search. They send us a deck and they send us some information, but you can augment that and you can find out, who are some of the competitors, maybe what are some of the patents in the space. You can see some of the market research, maybe backgrounds of the founders. So just it very quickly augments stuff like. And does it get it always right? No, but it's helpful. We also now use a tool that links into our own internal CRM, a note taker, right? So that when we have conversations with founders or with our portfolio companies or with like an industry expert that we're doing some diligence with, it will summarize that conversation. It will summarize next steps. And again, it's getting pretty good. It's getting pretty good.
The note takers are helpful.
Yeah.
What about AI agents? Do you feel like, because if you look at Aaron Levy, who's the CEO of Box on LinkedIn comment, he's got some very insightful thoughts to share about how the architecture of enterprise software is changing. And this is something that I feel like could be very hyped, but you hear this, okay, software as a service is quote unquote dead. It's more services as software, which is outcomes coming. I know.
It's just marketing. You just like, come on.
Dude, a fellow Exonian said this shit to me the other day. I was like, this is so bullshit. I can't stand it right now. I just told him.
Peel back the layers and figure out what it really means instead of.
Well, exactly. Well, even I'm having trouble describing it, but agents, I think the point being digital labor. Like this is what Benioff talks about. Benioff will say, I help my clients with digital labor, just a way of saying agents, which is a way of saying you don't need humans to do customer support anymore because an agent can pretty much do it most of the time. And it's predictive and blah, blah, blah. And so you're kind of starting to see that there's a company I just discovered yesterday called Manus. It's in China. Go check it out. It was like pretty, and there are more and more of these that I keep seeing where it's like, you can kind of like replicate what you've described as mostly research and compilation of data and sort of bringing all this information together in one place, which would have taken somebody a couple days to do, can take like 10 seconds,
Yeah.
right? Sure. Well, what if marketing outbounds were being done like that, right? Where like literally everything on a marketing campaign.
That'll happen. That's not far away, Vive. That's content. Right. The value of content is going down. Right. It's too easy to generate. If you want me to really blow your mind, I mean, I can, but I don't know if I believe all this stuff. I just hear it from people that are, bought in or at least trying to sell me something.
I see what you're saying.
The value of all software will go to zero too, because you can ask a model to write you, why do I need to buy Salesforce? I can just, hey, could you design me a CRM for venture capital that does this, this, and this? And boom, 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 I have my own piece of software. Yeah, I mean, there's lots of, I'm just saying, people are selling me these
I know
stories all the time.
Klarna apparently got rid of Salesforce and did their own. But, well, anyway, you and I could go in a lot of different directions. Yeah. I don't want to keep going because I know it's like you and I, there's a lot here. There's a lot here, right? There's so many different things to be going through on this whole set of subjects. But I think we should do this another time and like really talk more about this because this is definitely where we are in the world now with this figuring out what this means is like kind of a problem challenge, right? There's so many dimensions.
Well, and
to it.
You start to play it forward. If you do believe, I don't know, it's probably a when, not an if, but like, let's just, whether it's 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, the pace of change is accelerating, right? There's more and more people excited about this type of technology. So it's attracting, lots of smart people, whether it's people coming out of college or postdocs or leaving companies to go work in it, right? It's attracting a lot of smart people, more so than it did certainly a decade ago, right? And so you're going to think, okay, so it's only going to get faster. And so at some point, do we actually build something that might justify being called superintelligence, that is far more intelligent than a human, that is infallible or that is fallible, that doesn't make mistakes, right? Actually recalls facts the right way, et cetera, can actually diagnose you better than a doctor, these sorts of things, right? We probably can get there, probably in our lifetime, which is pretty exciting. But it does raise a ton of really interesting questions around, okay, then how do we fit into that society? And we've always really valued ourselves on being productive members of society and playing a role that we get paid for. And all these, a lot of that might erode if we actually get, and again, I think this is still probably a few decades away, but it's not an impossible future, right? It does seem to me like we probably will get there. So those are some really interesting, hard questions to try to think through. It could completely change how society functions to some degree.
Yeah. 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 And
That,
I
I mean,
mean,
again, that's just a fun thing to talk about.
it
I
really
am
is. Yeah.
definitely not an expert.
No, you know what, man? Your perspective on this is really helpful and important, and I know exactly what you're framing there, and it's really it's a frame that applies to the earlier conversation we had about how do we fit in, with smartphones, and how do our kids fit into this, and how do you raise teenagers in this, new milieu, and that's kind of what's really funny to me about the tech business is like what's old is new again all the time. And we're doing automation now. We were doing automation with mainframes in the beginning, and so each new wave of automation is faster and faster and faster and faster. So your perspective is awesome, super helpful, very interesting to me as a techno marketing geek, and I love it, dude. I love it to learn from you. So thanks for sharing everything that you have today. We'll do it again some other time. And that framing from the end, I think, is just really useful. The last thing I wanted to ask is, who would you nominate to be on the Class of 92 podcast next?
Hey, man, we are super lucky. We have a lot of great people in our class. I'm not sure there's anyone I wouldn't be interested in hearing from, really. I obviously stay very close to some of the Webster North folks, Dave and Will and Sam and Demeet. For a while, I was keeping up pretty well with Brendan Williams, but then he moved to the West Coast and it was harder to see him. Occasionally hear from Will Wellborn and Dan Klaus, and they're all doing interesting things. They really are. Sam's working in Hollywood. Will's building like super high end engineering products and like print heads and so on. Dave's takes care of. He's a doctor, right? He's seen some shit. So like, I don't know. I would bet it would be really interesting to hear from any one of them. I'm sure you could get Sam is one on the board. So he gives a lot of time to Exeter. And two, he loves talking about the movie business. In fact, he comes back. I think he's spoken at an assembly a couple of times on that topic, because who's not interested in that world?
Yep.
And then I think it would be pretty interesting to hear from, well, again, any one of them. Certainly Dave, who's taking care of patients, lives in the Upper Valley, lives near Dartmouth. He's got kids more my age. One daughter is about to graduate from college and one who's just started. And I bet you healthcare has changed a lot, right? Since
I'm sure it has. What kind of doctor is he?
He's a primary care physician, right?
Okay.
Like he's someone that you and your family would go see if you lived there.
Yeah, I would love to talk to Dave. I would love to talk to Will. I'd love to talk to Sam. I would love to talk to any of these guys. So, yeah.
By the way, and Brendan Williams did a pretty cool job. He worked in the NBA for a long time. Initially, as I understand it, as like a coach, like a life coach, so that players who all of a sudden, come from humble beginnings, all of a sudden have money, like giving them some coaching on like, don't blow it all on your friends in like 1 year. You might have a short career. You might like trying to actually give them some. So he did that for a while. Then I think he ran that program for the NBA while also going to law school. That must have been hard. And then wanted to become a GM. And I think at least for a season, maybe a few, he was the GM of the Kings, Sacramento Kings. I think he stopped doing that. And then he was working maybe with ESPN doing like analysis and stuff. But I've sort of lost touch. He might be doing, I think he also may be doing something developing players, like younger players now. Pablo Barrutia, I get to connect with every once in a while. I actually got they're doing a big triathlon. And he's awesome. Right.
But to me, what comes from the heart, like, man, you love your kids so much. Like, it's so clear. And it's also so clear how important it is to you that we get this thing right, that this shit is tobacco and you're just leaving them to it, right? As a society.
Yeah. It's not up on the internet anymore, but I wrote a blog post for my old firm, probably, I don't know how long ago, 12 years ago.
Yeah.
It basically made that argument, the sort of tobacco analogy, of like, this is this generation's tobacco. And these companies need to be more thoughtful about what they're doing to people and so on. I know, and again, we don't have laws, but is that really the only thing that should govern what you decide to do? Aren't ethics worth anything? So anyway,
Yeah.
Anyway,
Well, that's what came from the heart. Thanks for spending so much time with me today on a Sunday.
no worries. It was fun.
All right. Take care.
All right, buddy. Take care.
All
See
right.
you, Vives.
Peace.